Okay. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Biologically Speaking team, and a warm welcome to one of our first lecture of 2022. It's been long since we interacted, so thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm Shanak, postdoctoral fellow at the National Institutes of Health in the United States, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Today is a special day as we are preparing ourselves to celebrate the National Science Day to commemorate the illustrious discovery by Professor C.V. Raman, commonly known as Raman effect. And secondly, Biologically Speaking is completing its first year. We started off as an academic interest group where we try to communicate science to general public with an aim to build the next generation of scientists. We also post blogs, articles, so anyone willing to contribute to our initiative, please write to us via our website, www.biologicallyspeaking.com. And on the eve of National Science Day, we are delighted to have Krish Ashok with us as a speaker for this special session. And he writes in his book that he's not a scientist, but he can explain science with easy to understand clarity. And I think that's what we as a platform also promote here, where we try to convey the fun of doing science and communicate science in an easy way. So thank you very much, Ashok, for your time. We truly appreciate it. But before I introduce our speaker, a couple of housekeeping reminder for our audience. You can post your questions for our speaker using the chat box, and we will try to moderate them at the end of the talk. Please keep your mic off and videos turned off to maintain the bandwidth and to have our session ongoing. With that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's session, Krish Ashok, a software professional and the global head of the digital workspace at Tata Consultancy Service, TCS, which is an extremely demanding job, but he was able to follow and maintain some of his hobbies and passion. And that led me to one of his old TEDx talk where he says, disregard work, acquire hobbies, which I think is a great message to our audience. An avid musician, Krish Ashok is a trained Indian violinist who also plays electric guitar and cello. The other interest of his is cooking, and he writes he's not a chef, but cooks daily. And with this passion to integrate food science and engineering, he transformed his thoughts of Indian cooking and has recently authored a book called Masala Lab, The Science of Indian Cooking, where he uses simpler first principles instead of heavy scientific equations and upends a pantry load of myths concerning cooking, take down a lot of misinformations, patriarchy, and conformity, which I guess he will discuss today, ranging from evolution to the history of Indian cuisine, and which I believe will be truly delicious. A warm welcome to Krish Ashok to a platform which I'll be very tempted to call as Gastrobiologically Speaking, and very much looking forward to your talk. Over to you, Ashok.
Hey, thank you, Shonak. I hope I'm audible and clear and so on.
Yes, everything fine.
So I'm just going to let me share my screen and get started. Okay.
Sure.
All right. All right. So I hope the full screen is visible. Okay, great. So this is I've been cooking since I was 16 or 17. My mother had a busy job, and then she would travel often, and so she said, okay, let's pick out of her 3 children, let's pick the one that is least likely to set the kitchen on fire and cause an LPG explosion. And that's how, in a sense, I got to give me a second. There's some. Just one second. Yeah, here you go. All right. You're still seeing my screen. Is there some sort of window present in between, because I'm not able to see my mouse?
No, I think everything is fine.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So that's how I began to cook. And again, as someone who then went on to, if you will, get into the usual sort of mode of engineering, and I did electronic engineering. And then obviously at that time I was still a semi-professional violinist. And so I decided to get into software because it's the in 1999, it was the most amount of pay for the least amount of work. And in a sense, I think there was, I'm probably being uncharitable to software. Again, it's given me a fantastic career in about 22 years. But when you do software well, it's fundamentally about, one, breaking down things into smaller chunks that are easier to do, right? And easier to test and easier to debug, right? And the second thing is that you do not need a top-notch engineer from the best engineering college to be able to do software if you have the process right? And in a sense, my day job as well as my interest in science communication, I've been writing for a long while and so on. In a sense, I volunteer to teach physics and mathematics to government school kids locally to be able to explain. So the interest in explaining things from first principles has always been there. And I think in a sense, the idea of using the software metaphor to simplify things down into easier to digest modules, if you will, and using first principles that explain the why of what happens is how I got around to writing Masala Lab, right? And I was just pleasantly surprised that there was no book on the science of Indian cooking. All writing about Indian cooking was about the art and the history and the fantastic, socio-cultural diversity and heritage that this part of the country has, right? Now, so let me hold on. So let me kind of get to where this particular story is. And when I sometimes, when I speak to kids, often it's hard to get them excited about cooking. Okay, cooking is not something that people get excited about. And again, and particularly in India with the patriarchy in place, male kids little or no interest. Their mothers don't let them into the kitchen, let alone whether they have their interest or not. Right. So in a sense, over time, I've been thinking about how to communicate a certain sense of awe and wonder of really turning high school science, physics, chemistry, and biology, if you will, into a fascinating story that you can experience every day when you eat food, right? So, and that's why I said I came upon this idea that I could take a dish, right? Let's take a chicken curry, and the reason I chose a chicken curry is that it quite possibly is the single most unifying common side dish in India, right? And again, the domestication of jungle fowl into what we now today know as poultry, if you will, broiler, chickens and so on, is said to have happened in the Indian subcontinent. Whereas there's some debate that it might have also parallelly happened in China, but certainly it did happen around 6,000 years ago in the Indian subcontinent, right? And the second thing is it is the most single consumed animal protein in India. Okay, and as Indians are getting wealthier, the consumption is also increasing. Of course, there are problems with industrially caged birds and so on. But long story short, at the end of the day, there is something fundamentally uniquely unifying about chicken curry, right? And again, with due respect to vegetarians, at least I come from a part of the world where less than 2 or 3% of the population is vegetarian. South India, at least Tamil Nadu and Kerala. And in the east and the south of India, the percentage of vegetarians in the population is about, anywhere, typically less than 5%, right? The west and north are more meat eating, but again, they're also predominantly, they're predominantly meat eating, but with a larger proportion of vegetarians. Of course, anyway, you have Punjab, which has the highest, about 40% of Punjab is said to be vegetarian. I know it's interesting. You think of Punjab and you think butter chicken, but no, by proportion of population, the largest number of vegetarians in India are in Punjab. Rajasthan, Gujarat as well, pretty much equally high and so on. But what you find is that if in a sense, if I had to pick something, I think this is a reasonably unifying dish. But then if I have to tell an interesting story, I needed animal protein. So I couldn't really tell an exciting enough story about dal fry, right? To be honest. Okay. So because it's involved only, plant products. But okay. So in that sense, I said, how can I tell a story that anyone from a high school to somebody who does a graduation, whether in science or not science, and is still able to say, oh, this is what I sort of learned. This is what they were talking about in high school. Oh, this is what they exactly mean, and so on. And tell that story via food, right? And again, try and avoid anything that requires any kind of basic scientific knowledge, if you will, right? Detailed scientific knowledge. Okay. So in a sense, I'm going to start with the story of chicken curry think of it as a recipe that I will narrate to you over the next 45 minutes or so. But a recipe that essentially goes back almost 2.7 billion years ago. Okay. 2.7 billion years ago is when we estimate that we kind of had for a while, from about 3.5 billion years ago to, at that period of time, is we largely had single-celled, very simple organisms, and these were called the prokaryotes, right? And prokaryotes were very, very basic, right? In the sense that what we know today as the modern day cell, even if you take a cell from your body, if you will, right? This looks nothing like that. It's ultra basic, right? It's essentially a bag of nutrients, some DNA in a cell wall. That's really just about it, right? Everything is just freely floating inside. It's essentially, think of it as a sort of like a boundary that keeps entropy out. Largely, that's about it, right? And again, the role of the DNA is, again, primarily to be able to replicate, right? And so on, right? And in a sense, amongst the first self-replicating objects, if you will, on the Earth, right? But around 2.7 billion years ago, there were a fair number of them, largely again in the sea, and so on, largely nondescript, if you will, not really making any change to the Earth as we see it. But then about 2.7 billion years ago, one of these prokaryotes did something really interesting. Okay, and again, it's when you tell stories of evolution, sometimes it makes it seem like there is some sort of deliberateness about it. No, there isn't. Evolution is not deliberate. It is a statistical phenomena where essentially millions of experiments happen, and the experiments that work survive to tell the tale and reproduce to tell the tale. So, and when you do this at a massive scale, you can get all the complexity of life on Earth. So that aside, so what happens is that one of these prokaryotic cells, it is estimated, again, that it captured another cell. Normally, again, and there is nothing new in this, it is an arms race. Prokaryotes will regularly try to devour other prokaryotes to essentially make food for themselves, right? So you break them down into their constituent amino acids and sugars, and you essentially you then use it for your life, for your living, right? As it turns out, when this particular kidnapping happened, it did not destroy or eat that other prokaryote. That other prokaryote ended up surviving, living inside, and changing over time into its own thing that we now today call the mitochondria. Okay. Now, it's interesting. So this other prokaryote that is said to have sort of been captured, consensually kidnapped, if you will, ended up having a very different life, right? So for starters, it was, it's getting free food. In exchange, it ended up said, fine, I will take care of energy needs, because I don't have to do anything. I don't have to reproduce, and I don't have to take care of defense. I don't have to do all the other things. All I have to do is take care of energy supply, sort of like the powerhouse. That's why, in school, we learn mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell, but nobody tells you this story, right? That this was the background, right? Saying that once, and this event is called an endosymbiotic event. Is essentially, it looks like one eating the other, but in a sense, the thing that's being eaten is in an endosymbiotic relationship, if you will, right? And again, and so just so we're clear, it's not like this one thing happened and it happened only once. With evolution, probably several experiments happened, and this is the one that survived to tell the tale. Okay. But yeah, there's one more example of what happened, right? And I'll tell you why all of this is coming. So we started with prokaryotes, they became eukaryotes, and at some point of time, this kidnapping thing happened again. Okay. One of these sort of eukaryotic cells said, well, I'm going to do this kidnapping again, and kidnapped something that was able, if you will, another unicellular prokaryote that was able to photosynthesize, and that became the chloroplast. So what you see as the chloroplast inside a plant cell, particularly on the leaves and so on, essentially is an example of another cell that was trapped by a eukaryotic cell anywhere between 450 to 2 billion years ago, right? Again, very, very hard, single cell, fossil record is not exact. They don't exactly leave fossils and so on. Okay. So again, we know what chloroplasts are able to do, right? They are able to say, I don't need to hunt around. I don't need to figure out and find another single-celled organism to eat. I am simply going to tap what is essentially the largest, single most universal source of energy on the planet, which is light from the sun, right? So it was able to tap light from the sun, and essentially over millions and millions and millions of years, fine-tuned a process that we now today know as photosynthesis. But again, what we may not know is that photosynthesis, for those of you who study biology, of course, you know that it's a spectacularly complex process. It has thousands and thousands of steps of starting from capturing a specific wavelength, set of wavelengths of light. Funnily enough, the one wavelength of light plants have no use for is green. Okay, so they actually reject it. So the one color that plants have no use for is the color we associate with plants. That's why they're green. Okay, so they use all of the sunlight, and it is estimated less than 1 to 2% of sunlight actually ends up getting used, if you will. The rest are actually wasted, or either because they're not hitting the chloroplast, they're not hitting the right angle, what have you, right, or hitting the wrong surface, or maybe the plant is in the wrong, it's in shade, and all kinds of other factors. Anyway, less than 1-2% of sunlight is converted into energy, and again, the series of reactions, a whole bunch of enzymes involved that convert all of this finally, and the carbon dioxide that people like animals and all breathe out, the carbon in that again is finally converted into glucose. Okay, that's essentially the in a simplistic way. Okay, and I'm avoiding the whole ATP ADP cycle and all of that, but in effect, net simple idea is that plants in the context of food understand that they make carbohydrates and they make everything else, proteins as well, but they make carbohydrates primarily from the energy of the sun, and they turn the carbon dioxide that we breathe into essentially anything. So often I often tell people that where does the mass of the plant come from, right? Where does and people think, no, it pulls it out from the roots. No, it pulls it out from thin air. So if you want to tell people, you look at this giant tree, when something says that tree grew from thin air, you just point to a tree and say that tree grew over hundreds of years from thin air, right? Because the carbon largely comes from the carbon dioxide in the air, right? And likewise, animals, when we lose weight, very non-intuitive thing, when we lose weight by breathing out. Okay, so again, a very non-intuitive thing that sometimes people don't realize. So long story short, let's get back to our chicken curry. So photosynthesis, plants, prokaryotes turned into eukaryotes, once more chloroplast, photosynthesis, glucose, carbohydrates, etc. Right? Essentially, and then over millions and millions of years, plant evolves many ways in which they can synthesize carbohydrates, right? One category, obviously, cellulose, very hard cell walls. You have pectin, you have all these other things that are like very hard to digest by animals and so on, but form the bulk of the structure of the plants, right? And again, and these things are harder, which is why plant material, when you cook, why is a vegetable crunchy? Why is a fruit crunchy? Because again, it's a cellulose, hemicellulose, and these things that make it crunchy, right? Animal cell walls, different evolution, so they are more elastic. So meat, on the other hand, muscle tissue is a lot more softer. Again, bring it back into the context of food. Why does food taste the way it is? So why do starches taste the way they do, right? And again, when you heat starches, they essentially then they absorb water, and they, depending on whether it's amylose or amylopectin, one becomes slightly harder, which is why your biryani or pulao rice has a certain texture, and the other becomes soft and sticky. So your South Indian varieties of rice will tend to be stickier, jasmine rice and so on. There's more amylopectin, right? Again, depending on the structure of the carbohydrates and what happens when you apply heat and water, the granules absorb water and they burst, and they either get kind of hard structures or they get sort of sticky structures, right? So this is carbohydrates, right? And so in a sense, the next thing that plants did over time is, over millions and millions of years, they also said, well, I'm not the only thing on the planet. There are insects, there are microbes, there are fungi, there are bacteria, there are animals, and there's all these other things. And unfortunately, as a plant, I'm not very mobile, which is another interesting question. Why are plants not mobile, right? Why don't we have walking trees, right? Like Lord of the Rings, right? Why don't they walk around, grab something? Let's say you sleep under a tree. Surely, I mean, the law of the jungle applies. The tree should be able to throw out a tentacle and then eat you, because you're a lot of very useful protein, right? Why don't they do that? Now, it again all goes back to the evolution of photosynthesis, right? Now, as it turns out, when photosynthesis happened, the first sort of these phytoplankton, if you will, the ones that really dominated the earth back in the day, right, around 450 million years ago, they got so successful because, hey, you know what? Free energy. I'm going to reproduce like crazy. I'm able to turn sunlight into food. There's always sunlight. And again, warm oceans, I'm absolutely perfect, right? And so they got so successful so quickly that is what changed the amount of oxygen that we have on the planet, right? So there was less than 3 or 4% of oxygen, and then phytoplankton came. We in a very short amount of time, we got to the 20-21% oxygen that we have today, right? So again, it's interesting. Again, as people of science, you should know oxygen is a good thing, and we think it's a good thing for us. But in general, oxygen is not a great thing. Okay, oxidation is not great for most life, right? So what ended up happening is that one of the steps of photosynthesis, particularly an enzyme called rubisco, right? It turned out was not very good in a high oxygen atmosphere. Right? So what happened is that it evolved at a time when there was very little oxygen, very short, there was just too much oxygen. And evolution, especially when you have these very complex, almost Rube Goldberg-like sort of processes, that it's very hard to change something, go back in the past and change something to fix something in the future, right? It's like sort of how the laryngeal nerve of the giraffe, right? With evolutionary pressure selecting for taller and taller necks, the laryngeal nerve that really has to go just like a couple of inches from the ear to the throat, goes all the way down to the base of the neck and then comes back. Because that's how it was rooted when the giraffe's ancestor had a shorter neck. But as the neck grew, really in a very short amount of time, there was no way you could reroute something. So evolution cannot fix certain things. And this is one example, right? So photosynthesis is very inefficient in high oxygen atmospheres, right? And that generally means that plants are not capable of having metabolisms that are rapid, like a tiger just leaping, a burst of energy, a cheetah sort of running, or a human being running a marathon. All of these are examples of animals that have evolved to store energy that can be made available in a burst. And this is something that plants cannot do because of how incredibly inefficient photosynthesis. So they play the long game, okay? Meaning that they live hundreds of years, trees live sometimes thousands of years, and so on. And everything is in slow motion inside a plant, right? And so clearly, over time, what did evolution essentially do? Figured out chemical warfare. Well, if plants want to prevent an insect from eating it, plants want to prevent fungal infections, plants want to prevent any other kind of animals coming and chewing on it, they evolved a stellar range of chemical defenses. The ones that are more relevant to us is all the stuff we eat, right? Anything that has flavor, particularly spices, herbs, and so on, every one of these things is ultimately a plant trying to defend itself, okay? In a sense, so your onion, the moment you cut an onion, 30 seconds later, again, plants very slow. There's an enzymatic reaction that takes about 30 seconds to get activated. That a chain of reactions produces a molecule called syn-propanethiol oxide, which is volatile, and it goes straight into your eyes. And at that point, what happens is that it breaks down, and one of the things it breaks down into is dilute sulfuric acid, right? So an onion is essentially attempting to do a mild acid attack on you to prevent you from eating it, which again, as far as we are concerned, is fine because one, we are humans, we are smart, we've evolved fantastic knives. A really seasoned chef takes less than 30 seconds to chop an onion, right? So you won't find like master chefs, crying their eyes out because they do it so rapidly, right? You have other means you can do this. If you know a little bit of biology, reactions tend to occur better at room temperatures in the 25 to 35 range. So if you chill an onion just before you cut it, you're going to have a little bit of time. The reaction will happen even slower, right? So you want to chill the onion, and then you cut it, you're not going to have tears as much. So that's, again, a good way to really understand science and understand why reactions happen at higher temperatures and not at lower temperatures, and so on, right? So this is just onion. Chilies have evolved a molecule called capsaicin, which fantastically fit into the TRPV1 sensor into our trigeminal nervous system that senses temperature. And it is able to turn that receptor on, making your brain think that your mouth is on fire. Or actually skin, doesn't matter. That's why we use it in these pepper sprays that women use to protect themselves and so on. So capsaicin is essentially fools your brain into thinking your mouth is on fire. It's actually not on fire, right? That's why we call the sensation hot. That's why chilies are hot and so on. But it's actually a very phantom, and it sends a lot more water to your face in the form of blood circulation and sweat, in order to cool you down. And it also gives you a sort of like a dopamine rush, thinking that you must be in pain. So let me give you some pleasure to balance it so that, you're not incapacitated, right? And that's why people are addicted to spicy food, because it literally gives them a high. Okay? And again, you can really see every one of these plants. Eugenol from clove is such a powerful poison that 100% concentration eugenol is actually quite lethal, even for human beings. But in the concentration that's in a clove, well, it really, you cook something with these spices, those dishes are going to last longer at room temperature, right? So it's obvious why we adopted these things. They add flavor, but they add flavor not in taste. They add flavor as aromas. That's another key thing, right? So these are volatile molecules that you either smell after, as you chew on food, they travel through the back of your throat, and you kind of smell it, or and so on. So these are largely aromas in that sense, right? So this is chemical warfare. So again, what you're seeing here is roughly some of the ingredients we're likely to use when you make a chicken curry, right? You're going to use ginger, onion, garlic, if you will, chilies. You're going to use turmeric, coriander powder, and so on. Again, coriander is quite fascinating. So it has some of these aldehydes that some people find very soapy because they are sensitive to bitter tastes, and some people find perfectly fine, right? The interesting thing is that even people who do not like coriander, who strongly do not like coriander leaf, are okay with green chutney, because once you break, etc., there are other enzymatic reactions that actually reduce the amount of aldehydes that are there, and so on. So that's actually quite fine, right? So again, remember that the moment you damage a plant cell wall, reactions start taking place, right? So oxidative reactions start taking place. There's a enzyme called polyphenol oxidase that comes into play. So when you cut an apple and you just leave it, it'll start going brown, right? Happens to potatoes, happens to many things. So that's why we cut things and we put it in a bowl of water to create relatively anaerobic conditions underwater, right? So that's the basic reason. So again, this is in a sense where we've gotten to as part of our chicken curry recipe, we've now gotten to our plant ingredients, right? We've gotten to all of the plant ingredients. We understood why there is flavor. Flavor is basically chemical warfare against pests, and we are able to tame it by heat, which is why it's hard to eat a raw garlic, but cooked garlic is amazing, right? So we've developed a taste for muted versions of some of these chemical warfare molecules. And again, the plants do this because they cannot move about and defend themselves. And they can't do that because photosynthesis is slow. And photosynthesis is slow because we live in a high oxygen atmosphere that phytoplankton themselves created almost 450 billion years ago. And then those phytoplankton occurred as a result of one prokaryotic cell kidnapping first something to create the mitochondria, and second, again, to add a chloroplast, and that's why we have plants. Okay. So this is the first part of the story. Now let's get to so in a sense, from the ingredients in our chicken curry from Kingdom Plantae are onion, garlic, ginger, chilies, tomatoes, cumin, curry leaves, and coriander, and so on, right? So all of these essentially are coming from the plant kingdom. Now we're going to sort of really fast forward to something relatively recent. I mean, in comparison to 2 billion years ago, 65 billion years ago, right? 65 billion years ago, in what is today the Yucatan Peninsula, right? It is estimated that an asteroid, the crater is still there, by the way, one of the largest asteroids ever to hit Earth, right? And it was an insanely cataclysmic event, right? Cataclysmic beyond belief, right? It is estimated to have wiped out 80% of all life on planet Earth, and particularly all life above a certain size. Okay, and it is estimated this is what caused the extinction event of the dinosaurs, right? And so this is why we don't have dinosaurs today. So, and again, it's not just dinosaurs. It destroyed all large teeth. It destroyed a whole bunch of things, right? All life that we have today is evolved from the small fraction of survivors from this event, right? Either ones that were truly far away from the place of this thing, so which happened in obviously what is today the Yucatan Peninsula. But again, the continents were slightly different back in the day, so it's hard to sort of look and see what the distances might have been. But essentially, this ended up killing all the dinosaurs. It caused a nuclear winter for many, many, many years where the temperatures were low. And again, in fact, because the temperatures became low is when you suddenly started seeing, literally, pun unintended, mushrooming of fungi. Because fungi Yeasts and fungi generally prefer lower temperatures, damper, lower temperature conditions, and so on. And in a sense, it is also estimated that it is in fact, since reptiles tend to be cold-blooded and are very susceptible to yeast infections, they have to keep basking in the sun, right, to warm up their bodies, right? But then once this happened, not much sunshine for many years, reptiles had a double whammy. On top of all the large guys being destroyed by the meteor attack directly or indirectly, even many of the smaller ones did not have enough sunlight to bask. And so as their body temperatures came down, they were very susceptible to yeast infections. In fact, it is now said that the reasons why mammals really dominated were because they were warm-blooded, right? So our body temperatures, our ambient temperatures, it's amazing. They're typically just higher than what fungi generally like. If our body temperature was any lower, we'd be eaten alive by fungi around us. And there's just so many fungi around us. Okay, so mammals are remarkable in that sense. They've just evolved just that evolutionary machinery to have temperatures that are just above the kind of temperatures that fungi like. Okay, so this is obviously one thing, right? So obviously this was a massive event, right? And what is interesting is that the dinosaurs, that essentially you had these giant dinosaurs, both herbivorous as well as carnivorous, right? But you had a tremendous variety of dinosaurs. There were small dinosaurs as well. There were even flying dinosaurs as well, right? In fact, it is now estimated that dinosaurs may have had feathers, right? It's sort of funny to think about dinosaurs with feathers, but apparently they did, right? And it's some of these flying dinosaurs. In fact, this is an artist's estimation of what a T-Rex or one of these larger, dangerous-looking dinosaurs may have actually looked like, with feathers and so on. So now, what interestingly happened is that the smaller reptiles survived, the ones that were under the ground, and also the ones that were able to fly, right? I had a better chance of survival from this event, right? And it is from one branch of these flying reptiles that all modern birds originated, right? So the birds are today one of the few remaining descendants of the dinosaurs, right? And again, all the adaptations that we know with birds, hollower bones, overall lighter, are able to take flight, and all the other properties that we know associate with why flight is possible, again, got possible. And again, modern day birds evolved from dinosaurs, right? From that cataclysmic event, if you will. And again, one of these birds, the jungle fowl, was domesticated around 6,000 years in the Indian subcontinent. Okay. Domestication, again, essentially meant that you want to pick the really fatter ones that don't run away very quickly. Presumably, you also want to pick the ones that don't fly very well either, right? Because the last thing you want is a bird to fly away, right? So again, that is an act of artificial selection. So far, we've been talking about natural selection. Now we're in the realm of artificial selection, right? And again, we did that with plants as well, right? We selected for plants a wild onion, very different from a regular onion. A wild garlic, very different. Wild rice, wild wheat, all of these are fundamentally different plants than what we select them for. And actually, what we ended up selecting for, they would never survive in nature, by the way, right? So that's an interesting thing, right? A wheat plant is selected for making sure that it does not tip over and fall or does not disperse to the wind, right? All of these in natural conditions would have been a death blow for the plant. But human beings said, no, I want you because I just want to pluck the seeds directly. And by the way, I don't want you to put the grain on multiple branches. I want you to put all the grains on one branch, which again is evolutionarily a bad idea because you're literally putting all eggs in one basket. And so we selected for those traits to produce the modern day wheat, rice, and all the other grains that we eat. And likewise, we chose docility, lack of speed, and all these other things in the animals that we eat. And the chicken is a classic example of something like that, right? And over time, we've fine-tuned that. We've got breeds that are now that grow really, really fast, really quickly. We've got breeds that produce eggs almost every day, almost 300 days of the year. A wild jungle fowl produces eggs about once or twice a month, right? Not too different from how mammals might have periods. So that is essentially what the egg is, right? So essentially, all of this are examples of artificial selection at play, right? So we did this. And so, so the chicken essentially came from some of the few surviving, feathered dinosaurs back in the day. So this is the second story. And this wouldn't have happened, at least the way we now see it, if not for that asteroid impact as well. So that's the interesting story. And again, when I tell the story to kids, they ignore everything else and they're like, okay, we want to talk about the asteroid impact and so on. So in a sense, so let's kind of get to the food part, right? So the food part of this is essentially very simple, right? Whatever drove plants to go the way they did, right? Produce cellulose, hemicellulose, starches, pack their seeds with a lot of starch, a lot of fat and protein, and vitamins, etc., to help the growing embryo, and then have some mechanism of pollination, transport. Either animals eat it and go and deposit it somewhere and so on. So plants have their own mechanisms for why they produce what they produce. Animals, very simple. The evolutionary driving force for animals is, can I run away from danger? Can I catch food and eat it? That's literally it. And again, a side adaptation is that if I can't catch another animal, eat it, let me sit and develop an insanely complex and phenomenally hardworking digestive system, and turn into a herbivore, right? Again, remember that eating plants is not easy. A cow spends about 60-70% of all the energy that it gets literally digesting the plants that it eats, right? Plants do not want to be eaten. Okay, so that's the moral of the story. And so animals that evolved to eat plants have had to undergo all of that sort of special thing, right? Now, on the other hand, but so therefore plants have to move, plants have to walk, and so you had muscles and muscle tissue, connective tissue, bones, and so on, right? So when we think about what we eat, so when we're eating, in the context of the chicken, when you're eating just the breast, again, that we've selected these birds to not move around much, not fly around much, right? And unless the bird flies around much, the muscles in the breast are not really going to be exercised at all, right? Meaning that it's just largely going to be not very lean muscle tissue. It is also going to be muscle tissue that cooks really quickly at a very low temperature and very quickly and gets dried out very easily, right? On the other hand, the leg or the thighs is the one part of the chicken that it uses quite a lot. It's walking around all the time. And so therefore, and it also is going to have a lot more connective tissue because it's connected to the bone, and a bunch of these other bones to the wings and so on. So that's the part of the thigh muscle as well as the wings is where a lot of the flavor is. Okay? Because these are more heavily used muscles, also take a longer time to cook. Okay? And so that's why the other thing is obviously is that when you buy chicken, you want to obviously try as much as possible to try and use, if at all you want boneless, go for boneless thigh as opposed to boneless breast. Breast is the most tasteless meat in the history of the planet, maybe with the exception of turkey, which is just uniformly bad. Okay, but essentially, so you have so this, right? The other thing is that it's always good to leave a little bit of the skin on because fat transports flavor. Okay, so we'll kind of talk about that, right? And so when you cook something with fat, as it renders out, the spices are going to dissolve in that fat, and actually it's much tastier. And chicken fat is amongst the tastiest fats you will ever cook in, right? As if you've never cooked in it, always ask your butcher to give you extra sort of fat, render it down, and it's called schmaltz. And again, it is tastier than ghee. It is the tastiest animal fat you will ever use. Okay, so in that sense, so keep that in mind, right? So again, so what do we get from Kingdom Animalia? We got the chicken, we got butter, right? So where did we get the butter? Again, mammals. One of the things they evolved is the ability to feed their young, right? And that allows them to ultimately have larger brains, have a lot more time growing up, being taken care by a parent, and so on. And the fat from that is essentially what the saturated fat from that is essentially what goes into butter, right? From milk and so on, right? So now that we've got the ingredients, okay, so now let us kind of get into the kitchen itself, right? So what happens? So first and foremost, we've historically sort of cooked in materials like clay and so on. But think about it for a moment, evolutionarily, not just evolution, but we're talking about human evolution now and human society, right? And if here we are not so much in genetics as in memetics, meaning that these are ideas that human beings, they invented fire, they invented cooking and so on, right? Now, historically, I think the first breakthrough is the fact that you could hunt an animal and then you could cook it over fire, right? And the moment proteins are denatured, right, or a vegetable or a fibrous root vegetable is sort of cooked in fire, it's easier to eat, right? And all of a sudden, human beings had way more calories all the time the moment they had fire, right? The moment you had a lot more calories, And then obviously, I think over time, your body is going to spend most of its budget not on metabolizing and digesting. I mean, think about if you had to eat a raw potato versus a cooked potato. The amount of effort your body has to put in is several orders of magnitude more. And so a lot of that energy budget is spent on brain development, right? And that essentially, in a sense, what made us Homo sapiens is cooking is said to be one of the most central things that make us Homo sapiens, right? Although cooking may not have been invented by just Homo sapiens, but also perhaps even by Homo erectus, who we now know perhaps had definitely knew how to make tools and also have controlled fires and so on. At least that's what the modern day fossil record seems to be showing. But long story short, but there's also a leap from simply cooking something directly over a fire, and the breakthrough where you're able to create a vessel and allow cook things inside water. So the water, cooking something in a water and making a gravy or a soup is another path-breaking invention, because again, for the first time, if you didn't have good teeth, right? If you weren't able to hunt and so on, you're dead. Okay? But the moment you're able to make a gravy, things change, right? Even those with bad teeth, bad illnesses, weaknesses, etc., now can be taken care because they can be given food, because you can cook it down into a mush and it's easy to eat that. And again, so therefore, cooking in water inside a material that keeps it from leaking out is another path-breaking invention, if you will, that really changed humanity and ultimately led to civilization, and so on, right? So therefore, we kind of started from clay, and then obviously, in a modern day standpoint, I think what you need to remember is that a lot of flavor in meat comes from something called the Maillard reaction. Okay, that is when you grill meat on any kind of temperature that's higher than the boiling point of water, amino acids and sugars interact to produce a range of fantastically aromatic products and also brown colored molecules that we associate with delicious food. Small little fun fact: when proteins and sugars combine at very high temperatures in a very short amount of time, you get the Maillard reaction and you get delicious food. Okay, but when proteins, amino acids, and glucose, sugars, combine at room temperature, at body temperature, over a long period of time, for about 70 years or so, you get aging. Because those similar Maillard reaction byproducts are what potentially cause a lot of the aging things that we see, including now they're associated with many cancers and so on. But in a sense, it's remarkable to think that what makes food delicious is also the slower version of that reaction is what ultimately causes you to die. Okay. So anyway, on that note, so therefore, if you want to, the use of metals is interesting because metals are able to impart a ton of heat in a very rapid amount of time, right? So that's why you grill something directly on a piece of metal, right? And again, it also means that you can truly cook at above the temperature of boiling point of water only on a dry metallic surface. Okay? You can't do that inside water because the water, as long as there is liquid water, the temperature will be below 100. So you can't have Maillard reactions. That's why any gravy you make is never going to be tasty unless you grill the meat a little bit ahead of time or bake it and then you add it. The reason butter chicken is tasty is because it's tandoori chicken that's already been baked in a tandoor at 450 Celsius at extraordinarily high temperature. So it's not very dry. It hasn't lost a lot of moisture, but it's also beautifully browned on the outside. And it's also got that smoke flavor on it. And then that is added to a gravy, right? That's why it's tasty, right? If you just take chicken out of your fridge and directly add it to a makhani gravy, it's the worst kind of, it's not a very tasty butter chicken, right? So that's the point here. So this also, again, is a good way to understand the differences between what happens when you place a piece of meat directly on in a vessel is that the metallic surface is going to transfer a ton of heat really, really fast, right? Again, why? Because, well, a solid has more atoms, per square meter. And once all of them have a lot of energy, they're going to transfer a lot of that energy, right? It's again, atoms moving around, molecules moving around, vibrating, colliding with others, transferring energy, right? Transfer of kinetic energy is essentially what transfer of heat is, right? Now, but in water, obviously water is a liquid, fewer molecules around. So it takes a longer time. So this is also, by the way, when you touch a metal pan at 100 Celsius, it will burn your finger. You can put your hand in 100 Celsius water. It'll scald you, but not really bad. But 100 Celsius oven, you won't even feel it, right? Again, it's because something can be at the same temperature, but then its density determines how much heat it can transfer to you. That's why conduction far more efficient than convection. But the advantage of convection and a liquid medium is that a liquid will evenly transfer heat from all directions. On the other hand, when you place something on a dry pan, because you don't have perfectly flat surfaces, you only have some parts that are making contact. Everything ultimately at the molecular level has grooves, right? So some will make contact, some will not. And so it's not even in that sense. So some bits might end up getting burnt. And once things get burnt, they produce a lot more, carcinogenic substance, acrylamide, and so on, right? Etc. So the other thing to remember is that in the context of cooking, that fats absorb flavor, right? Most of your plant defense molecules, right? Think about it logically. If they were water soluble, then one rain will wash it all away. So many of these molecules are fat soluble, okay? And therefore, that's the reason why in Indian cooking, the first thing you do to a pan is add oil, right? Heat the oil, add whole spices. All the spice flavor molecules dissolve into the oil, and it's that flavored oil that is the crux of all the flavor in your dish. Nothing you add after that doesn't really matter, right? So which is why I often tell people that if you start with mustard oil and add, mustard seeds, radhuni, which is sort of celery seeds, fenugreek, fennel, and nigella seeds, regardless of what you do after that, it will taste like a Bengali dish, because that's the flavor profile, fat plus spice flavor profile combination of Bengali food, right? And so in that sense, that's why Indian cooking starts with this and ends with tadka again, right? Again, you're giving hot spices in hot spices and hot oil, getting those flavors, and you're giving that last sort of reminder that, oh, by the way, this is the flavor profile of the dish, right? So in a sense, even if you wanted to make that's why it's so easy to take any Western dish. You add a tadka, it will turn into an Indian dish. That's as simple as that, right? Now, again, also cooking is about breaking large into small, right? Digestion is about breaking large into small, and cooking is the outsourcing of digestion, right? So we don't have to do all the hard work that a cow has to do, because our pots actually did that. They gelatinized the starch. They made it easier. They made it easier for our salivary amylase to turn that cooked starch into sugars, right? You keep chewing a French fry for a few minutes, it'll start to taste sweet because the amylase would have broken down the amylose in the starch into glucose. So that's essentially what's happening, right? So, but you can also, breaking large into small, it's not just done by cooking, right? You can also do this by fermentation, right? So that's again a uniquely brilliant sort of human ingenuity of saying, you know what? Cooking is sort of like a very crude thing. I'm using heat, I'm using acids, I'm using physical damage of cutting and so on, and I'm trying to do all of this, etc. But what if I have a living thing which can operate at the molecular level, right? So essentially, fermentation is the world's most ancient form of molecular gastronomy, taking friendly microbes and saying, look, I'm giving you this source. You eat whatever you want, but I want these byproducts. Okay, milk spoils very easily. Please eat all the lactose. I'm largely lactose intolerant. Human beings mostly are after they're weaned from their mother's milk. Turn it into lactic acid. And the fact that it's acidic now will keep all the other bacteria away, because lower the pH, the longer it will last, because other bacteria and fungi will not attack it. And so therefore, I now can, preserve milk. And by the way, has a lovely taste as well, right? And by the way, I can do this with vegetables. I can lacto ferment anything, right? I can, again, use a microbe like a yeast to say, fine, eat all the starches in this wheat, right? And then you fart out carbon dioxide. But because I know that this wheat has gluten, which forms a stretchy structure and is also waterproof, because when you knead, what happens is that all of the water-loving parts of the protein structures come inside where the water is, and all the water-hating parts align on the outside. So the whole surface is largely waterproof in that sense. So it's also, it makes it an opaque sort of way, so the gas cannot escape, right? And so all the yeast eating inside, all the carbon dioxide forming holes inside, allows me to turn what would other been a hard lump of wheat into a fantastically airy, remarkable, soft piece of bread. And on the outside, because an oven is much higher than 100 Celsius, gets browned beautifully, thanks to the fact that there's 15% of wheat is protein, the rest is carbohydrates. They react to form the Maillard reaction, and the quintessential smell of a bakery is the Maillard reaction at play, right? So again, so that's fermentation and all of that stuff is happening, right? Now, browning, we spoke about the Maillard reaction. And again, interesting thing, when you're making a chicken curry, people sometimes think that vegetables are easier to cook than meat. No, they're not. Okay, vegetables cook at a higher temperature than meat does. Okay, a piece of steak is officially cooked at 52 Celsius, safe to eat at 52 Celsius. That's where you can eat a rare steak. Starches, on the other hand, take about 72 Celsius before they're actually cooked, right? So, which is why when you make something with both vegetables and meat, you're either going to overcook the meat or undercook the vegetables. Almost always a good cook will cook them separately and mix them towards the end, right? So that's why interesting. When you're making a chicken curry, always good to marinate, bake, do whatever it is you want with the chicken, and then add it to the dish, right? Of course, but if you're using a dish where the intrinsic flavor is coming from the umami and all of the other breakdown of the gelatin and the connective tissue and all that, you're using bone-in chicken and so on, then what you want to do is obviously you still want to cook the vegetables, the onion and all of that first, and then you add the chicken and let it slowly cook. The key thing is to still keep the temperature below 70 Celsius or so, because otherwise the proteins will denature and lose a lot of moisture. Right? But of course, you can avoid the use of the loss of moisture by brining the chicken, right? By soaking it in salt, an 8% salt solution. Again, interesting thing, you can explain this to people by saying that when you run and you get dehydrated, right? You exercise, you get dehydrated. You're going to drink water to replenish the lost water. You're going to drink salt to replenish the lost salt via your sweat. You're also going to drink sugar to give you energy, and so on, right? So this is essentially what you think about what the salt actually does, right? So when muscles have salt, they lose less water. Okay. So the reason you drink salt in your electrol or whatever it is after you, or Gatorade or something, after when you're having sporting activity and so on, the reason those drinks have salt is they prevent any further moisture loss from your muscles, right? You can apply the same principle when it actually comes to cooking chicken. So if you brine your chicken for about an hour in an 8% salt solution, and then you cook it, the muscle tissue will not lose as much water during the cooking process, right? And so you'll get much juicier and softer, tender chicken when you actually make it, right? So, and again, so all interesting. So we spoke about conduction, convection, and so on. The other form of heating in the kitchen is radiation, which is microwave, right? It's remarkable. Again, it's interesting how engineers figured out that, well, I can use a little bit of quantum physics and the fact that microwave at a specific frequency is good at heating up water molecules, which are actually polar, because the oxygen is a little bit more negative and the hydrogen ends up being positive. Water is a polar molecule, so that's why it ends up sticking to each other, and that's why water is a liquid at room temperature. And by the way, that's why life is even possible. That's covered in the first chapter of my book, about why the fact that all of this is simply because of the sheer insane luck that water happens to be a liquid at the temperatures life likes to be, right? While hydrogen sulfide is a gas, right? Similar in the periodic table and so on. So long story short, a microwave radiation essentially heats up, ends up flipping water molecules into its sort of electromagnetic field, and you keep changing the direction of the microwave, the water molecule will keep flipping, and that you're flipping, essentially you're adding kinetic energy, and that's essentially heat, right? So the water is getting heated. So you can literally heat things from the inside, right? So it's exactly how a microwave works. And that's also why you can largely only cook things that have a fair amount of water, right? Usually not other things, right? Now, let's kind of get to the last few things and then we'll get into Q&A, which is flavor biochemistry, right? That people think that all the action is actually happening in the tongue, but no, 80% of the action is happening in the nose, right? So what happens is that when you taste food and your tongue and your enzymes are breaking down the food, all those flavor molecules that you dissolved in the fat are going to then rise up. They are volatile, and you smell them in your nose behind, and that's why. And again, this is also, by the way, why some things that smell bad from the outside, like fish and cheese, are delicious from the inside. Because you're breaking them down and then you're releasing other molecules that are not available to you when you just smell them from the outside, right? So this is again, right. So the idea that there are these spots on the tongue where, oh, this is sweet, that is sour bitter, that's wrong. It was based on a wrong translation of a German textbook in the 1960s. Every part of your tongue can taste every kind of taste. There are parts of your tongue that have a higher density of taste buds, like the tip of your tongue and so on. So, but you could taste anything on the tip of your tongue, not just not only sweet and salt taste and so on. Again, interesting that how we did speak about the effect of digestion itself and how it's the outsourcing of essentially cooking is the outsourcing of digestion, and fermentation again is the outsourcing of digestion, where you're letting microbes create smaller, more aromatic, more tasty molecules that you are able to, and more bioavailable amino acids as well. So when you ferment rice and urad dal, the fermentation process actually makes a lot more amino acids available than otherwise would be, right? Even vitamin B as well, right? And so on. Now, a couple of interesting things before I end, which is that there is also this new sort of a study called Gastrophysics, sort of somewhat at the intersection of gastronomy, marketing, and a little bit of behavior science and so on. It now turns out that we're not as objective about taste as we think we are, right? The color of something affects the perception of how it tastes, right? So for instance, if you want to consume less sugar in your life, right, and you somehow like sugar in your tea, okay, you might want to consider investing in a red cup, okay, because things that you consume in a red cup or a lead plate taste sweeter than they are, because we associate the colors red and pink with sweeter tastes because of evolutionary associations with strawberries and fruits, apples, and so on. We have that sort of association. So a red cup allows you to actually use less sugar, if you will. So again, so these are tricks that you can actually use, right? The shape of an object actually impacts the taste as well. We associate sharper straight lines with sour, acidic, and bitter tastes, and we associate rounder shapes with fatty and sweet tastes, right? So it's quite fascinating. In 2013, Cadbury Dairy Milk apparently changed. For those of you who might be older or my age, you'll know that dairy milk used to have straight sort of, quadrilateral, almost like a parallelogram type of a shape, right? Or sort of like a trapezium kind of a angular straight shapes. But now the dairy milk has rounded, more sort of dome-like shape and so on, right? Apparently, when they changed to the rounded one, the reason they did it was because the rounded one allowed them to shave a few grams to cost cut and give you less chocolate for the same amount of money effectively. But what they didn't account for was the fact that customers wrote in and said, your chocolate has become way too sweet. And they said, no, we haven't changed the formula. All we've changed is the shape. And that's all it takes, right? For you to change your perception. Things like, when you see today's food ads and so on, the reason today a lot of the food advertisement is always like, things being poured, you'll slow motion, honey being dripped, and things always in motion. So there's never still photos of food, is because when we see food in motion, we are associating it with fresh food. Okay, so it's almost an interesting brain wiring that we have. So that's why we have if you want to make an impactful ad, etc., your food's got to be moving all the time, right? It can't be still. Okay. We can also be primed by a lot of other things. Like, for example, we associate vanilla with sweet things. Vanilla by itself is not sweet. Okay. Vanilla is purely an aroma. Okay. But we associate vanilla with sweet because we are used to vanilla ice cream, vanilla milkshakes, vanilla whatever, cookies, and so on. So dishes where, again, you want to consume less sugar, adding vanilla allows you to get away with adding less sugar because the brain will fill in the rest of the blanks. You're primed to expect that it's going to be sweet. If anything, that's why also vanilla is such a sophisticated flavor. You can't make a savory dish from vanilla because it's going to, people will not accept it, right? Just like as people will not accept something that's yellow in color but tastes like strawberry. They will not expect it, and so on. And likewise, apparently, if your favorite sports team won a match, the food will taste sweeter than it otherwise would have been. And if your team lost a match, you're going to find food to be a lot less sweet. And you'll end up consuming more sugar as a result of that. And so coffee will taste more bitter when you're literally in a bad mood and so on. So the way our brains are wired is because it's the memory and nostalgia part of the brain that deals with flavor, that you're going to have all these kinds of very bizarre reactions to sort of fallacious reactions to food, right? So I want to sort of end with this, saying that, I think it is important that we understand, and everyone understands where food comes from, in not just its sort of history, evolutionary. I think that part really makes the science exciting, and I hopefully makes kids more excited and people more excited about science in general, and so on, and makes them less prone to misinformation and pseudoscience later in life. The other, it also helps us understand sustainability. It helps us understand what comes from where, right? I mean, what is a cage-free chicken versus where what is these, the carbon dioxide or the carbon footprint of, say, the beef industry, and so on, right? And again, interesting things like, for example, organic produce, essentially because they use fewer pesticides, or less efficient pesticides, if you will, end up being attacked more by pests. And when a plant is attacked by pests, it produces more flavor molecules, right? So this is why organic produce is tastier than plants that never experience any attacks in their life, right? And again, likewise, other things like, for instance, a fresh vegetable that you pick up in a supermarket in a city probably was harvested at suboptimal ripeness many, many months ago. And then it was bought over to you, right? And ripening chemically on the way. But a frozen vegetable was harvested at peak nutrition and frozen a few hours. And as anybody who understands biology, at -15, no biological activity. It's frozen in time. So a frozen carrot is actually fresher than a fresh carrot. Again, some of these other things, right? And again, because of the fact that we all process flavor using the part of the brain that deals with memories and nostalgia, every individual's experience of flavor and memories of flavor is based on their own personal experiences. No two people experience flavor the same way, right? So the reason your mother's dal is the tastiest thing, is tastier than a Michelin star restaurant's dal, is not because your mother's a better cook. It's because your flavor memories of the dal include her, include the location, include a lot of the other context, which a restaurant does not give you. Similar to why chaat tastes better, if you will, on the street, because all the context, the crowds, the sweat, the environment, and all of that is part of the flavor experience, and not the sterile environment of a 5-star restaurant, where perhaps the guy is making even better flavored, more finely tuned chaat. It doesn't matter. You're still going to like it on the street, and so on. So, which therefore means that, geography does not lend authenticity to food. People do, and people migrate all the time, right? And I'll end with this example. Pav Bhaji is at once the most Indian and the least Indian food items. The word pav is Portuguese in origin. Portuguese introduced bread baking, at least with yeast in India, in Goa. And then the potato comes from South America. The capsicum, tomatoes, chilies, and so on come from Mexico. The beans, the carrots, the cauliflowers all come from Europe. Not a single ingredient in pav bhaji other than the spices is of Indian origin. And yet it is uniquely Indian. And I think in that sense, if you understand your own biases, if you understand the fact that what you grew up eating is what's going to determine what you can tolerate later. And most religions and castes and cultures tend to take advantage of that, right? Oh, you will not eat pork. You will not eat beef. You will be vegetarian. You will not eat anything that grows under the ground. The moment you do that, you are very hard to break out of that and truly experience how somebody else may experience food, right? So in that sense, that's never judge what other people eat or what other people like. And that's why I say ignore all restaurant opinions, because every opinion on food is an individual sharing their bias based on their upbringing. There is just no objective reporting about food. So you should ignore all food opinions in general, right? On that note, thank you. Hope you enjoyed this. Maybe we'll take some questions and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashok, for that fantastic talk, illustrating the basics of biology and evolution and how they impact our daily lives. It's just truly phenomenal. It's an interdisciplinary dish that you have connected from biology to chemistry, thermodynamics to evolution. The next time I eat a chicken curry, I think your insights will definitely resonate in me. We have got a couple of questions which I'll take, but before I actually take audience questions, I have one of my questions as moderator. It's like, it really needs a lot of dedication and experience that you gather every day and write a book like Masala Lab. Could you share that motivation, and when did you think that this is something that you'll present to the world, and what were the challenges that you faced?
To be honest, I had writing about food was actually not my first choice at all. In fact, writing a book wasn't my first choice at all. In fact, I grew up at a time when I felt that I could reach a larger audience by writing on the internet and being on Twitter and Instagram, rather than if you will, the Indian publishing, so the reach of a typical book is very small in India, right? 3,000 copies is considered break even for a publisher. So that's how low the bar is, right? So if that's your audience, so I historically used to think that, I could just share what I've learned in real time rather than write a book. But over time, obviously, as I've grown older, I've recognized the value that a book is there for the ages. Your tweets and all of these things will disappear one day, and so on. But a book is going to be around. Libraries will be around. This human knowledge is always going to be. And the act of writing, putting down 65,000 words on paper is different from putting down 280 words in characters in a tweet, because the act of writing is as much about deciding what to leave out as what to leave in, right? A great book is not something, it is not something that contains everything, but makes a careful choice of what to leave out, and again, how to use language in a way that makes it accessible to a wide audience, right? And so that's why I think writing a specialist book is much easier than writing a book for a general audience. And I think it's so in that sense, I think, but that's what I guess the publisher convinced you need to do that. You do that very well, and so you should do this. And so my first proposal was to write some sort of science fiction short stories set in Chennai, sort of a book. And then they said, no, the pandemic has started. I think maybe you should write nonfiction because people might want to learn. And then I kind of felt that, look, as with my background, I can write about IT and software. Enough books have been written. I could write about music, but then somehow writing about music is a hard thing to do, right? You can make music, you can just sing, but writing about music is not something that I was interested in doing. It struck me that the only other thing that I did and paid close attention to in a daily life was cooking. And again, when I've been cooking for 20 years, I have notes going back for the last 20 years of what I cooked, what turned out well, which days were disasters. So how much percentage of water did I use in the atta? So in the section of, there's a section of my book where I talk about how the fact that this entire book came from all the notes that I've made over the last 10 or 20 years. So it didn't take too much time. What took time was figuring out what to leave out and what to keep in, and structuring it in such a way that it's like it doesn't read like a textbook, but it's something that you can read in one sitting. Right? Oh, there's something new that I'm learning, and there's something interesting, and so on. Right? So I think that is how, I guess, if anything, I think I would say, my editor did a good job of also saying that if a typical arts graduate, literature, English sort of honors graduate, who's one of my sub-editors and so on, cannot understand the science using whatever science she understood in high school, then you need to change it. And I think that helped keep it. Otherwise, it would have been easy to write a book for the nerds, for the science nerds and all of that. But writing for a wide audience, I think was in some sense the challenge that I think was quite rewarding.
No, I think it's phenomenal. And our heartiest congratulations for writing that book. It clearly had a long-lasting impact to our lives. So I'll take one question from Chonchari Gorai. She's asking, the science behind those spices is so fascinating. I have a naive question. Some people have dislike towards aromatic garam masala. What is the basis of this dislike? And the most surprisingly, they dislike coriander leaves also. So how garam masala can be processed scientifically to help them taking these wonder spices?
So garam masala, if you think about it, is actually a mix of anywhere from 10 to 15 different spices. And often garam masala is a mix of very strongly aromatic spices. Okay? So within your Indian spices, there is your cumin, coriander, and so on. These are what you call the cheap spices. The amount of flavor oil in them is relatively smaller in comparison to, say, a cardamom or a clove or a cinnamon or a star anise or a black cardamom. These are more pricey, more expensive, and packed with a lot more high density, stronger, a wider range of molecules, and so on, right? And so if you think about it historically, again, a purely Indian context from what I've seen, is that because before refrigeration, there was a preference to use the stronger spices for meat, because it would, in a sense, hide any spoilage that is naturally likely to happen with unrefrigerated meat and so on. And also some gamey, wilder animals are going to smell a lot. The meat will smell a lot stronger, right? So if you've had sort of, chicken bought in a store, has like no odor, no aroma, nothing. But a country chicken has a strong odor because of its diet, and so on. Likewise, if you hunt a deer, I mean, that it is an acquired taste. In fact, many people cannot deal with the strong smell. In fact, even mutton has, because goats tend to have a diverse diet, they just walk around, eat whatever they want, or they don't have a controlled diet, mutton has a stronger smell, right? Than even beef, right? Because beef actually, you control what they eat. You can't control what goats eat because they tend to roam around, right? And so therefore, historically, what has happened is that certain spices began to be associated with meat, and certain milder spices began, coriander, coriander seeds, cumin seeds, etc., began to be associated with vegetarian or plant-based meats. And at some point of time, estimated around the 7th or 8th century, is when over time the Brahmins in Hindu society kind of decided to become vegetarian. They historically meat eating, because the Vedas are very, very much references to a lot of cow slaughter and bull slaughter and yajnas and all of that. But at some point of time around the post-Buddhist times is when a segment of the elite segment of the population then became vegetarian, and then they stopped using those spices, largely because they were only eating plants, right? So because they were too intense. Now, all of a sudden, you find an urban India, post-independence India, where all of these things are now mixing. Because now you have a veg biryani that has all those spices you historically associated with meat. So what I find is that people who have a strong aversion to garam masala, two things. One is it's possible that they find that it's too lazy to just use it on every dish and you get that strong smell. You hide poor cooking by adding a garam masala at the end. But truth be told, my guess is that it's actually coming from a longer, deeper part, that if you're likely vegetarian, grew up vegetarian, you're going to have a slightly a negative reaction to garam masala as well. So that's one of the reasons. Again, I could be wrong, but yeah, there's one way. Yes.
No, I think that's great. I mean, our audience questions are pretty diverse, so I really enjoy reading some of these questions. So I'll take a question from Deepa Podia. What are your thoughts about our gut microbiota with our food preferences? After taking antibiotic courses, I think many of us have a different experience of food taste. Do you think it is just the side effects of the antibiotics, or can the experience be translated to lifelong experience of taste association with our normal microbiota?
This is, so gut microbiome is such a fantastically evolving area of study. And so many things that we learned about nutrition, metabolism is being flipped on its head as we understand more about the gut microbiome, right? I think the bigger picture is that what you eat is as much about feeding your cells as it is about feeding your gut microbiome. And a healthy gut microbiome is now associated with a whole range of positive health impacts, prevention of cardiovascular diseases and so on. That is just fascinating, right? So net effect is that typically the plants you eat, okay, a bulk of that is actually going to feed the microbiome, typically in a traditional diet. But unfortunately, we've been processing plant materials to the point where we've now created things like flours and maida and white rice and these kinds of products that have nothing for that microbiome. Right. So they are waiting for the stuff that you cannot digest, because remember, it's going through the small intestine, will take everything before it goes to the large intestine. Okay. And so it's only the remaining bits that get there. So that's why a high fiber diet and also diets that use legumes that have resistant starches that you don't digest very well. That's why you eat a rajma. It has some starches that you cannot digest at all. They then feed the bacteria. The bacteria are very happy. Well, you then get uncomfortable because it's going to generate a lot of carbon dioxide in your intestine when you eat rajma, right? Beans are associated with flatulence as a result. And so in a sense, I think the growing realization is that those bacteria now have a phenomenal impact on many things. They can incentivize you to, they can have impact on how your moods, they can have impact on what you like and what you find tasty, etc., by releasing hormones into your blood and so on. So it is just a fascinating to really see where all of this is indeed going. But long story short, I think, the more you eat and feed your microbiome, the better. And therefore, the more diverse number of things you eat, the better. And less processed food you eat, the better. Yeah. Yes.
True. So next question is from Krishnamurti Srinivasan. Great talk on the evolution of food. In his book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, describes cooking as the most significant aspect of the domestication of fire in the course of human evolution. I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
I think I did mention this, right, in my talk, which is that I think cooking is quite genuinely, and I think many experts believe this, that is what made us human and what made us kind of dominate the planet, if you will, right? As I said, if the one of the metabolism of food is the single most energy intensive activity any living thing does. Okay, and the fact that human beings don't have to do as much because you're doing a lot of the breaking down outside of your body in the cooking vessel, in a kitchen, is what I think makes us so remarkable. And in a sense, I think we are the only species that cook our food. Yes, of course, there are others that might, in some senses, use fermentation. There are animals that have been known to bury their food and let it ferment. You could theoretically consider that, but again, effectively. But I think having a kitchen and breaking food down in a structured manner before you eat it is very, very uniquely human. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think we're running out of time, so I'll take the last question for today's session. This is by Uma Chandrasekharan. What are your thoughts on foods that heat or cool our bodies as spoken of Indian systems, or more importantly, like rapid cooking, like air frying, microwave versus slow cooking for taste and nutrition?
So, okay. So on the one about every society on the planet in prehistoric times, so it's not like medicine, modern day medicine is about it may be 150-year-old discipline, if you will, in the way we know it today, and so on. But human beings have been around for a while, right? For at least 2 million years. And so on, and at least easily about 65,000 years as in the Cro-Magnon sort of Homo sapiens sort of this thing. And so therefore the ability to try to understand what is good for the body, what is bad for the body, etc., has been an obsession with any society for purely survival standpoint, right? And the way I think of it, I think I want to be respectful of people who did this in the past, which is that human beings are, in a sense, our brains are brilliant at, if you will, looking at phenomena and finding metaphors and finding analogies and classifying them, right? So it's a unique thing that human beings do. We categorize, we create ontologies, we represent knowledge, and we represent knowledge in a way that for most of our history, we are able to transmit to another human being so that they don't make the same mistakes. So again, a fascinating thing, because I think human beings do that better than others, and language helps us do that. And so you need representation, ways of which you can observe phenomena and explain it using metaphors that are easy to transmit and understand. Okay, and then again, once you got into writing things down, it just got better, because then you don't lose fidelity, right? Because it's now printed down in a clay tablet and is written, and so there is no ambiguity, right? And so on, right? So in that sense, you look around the world, if you take some, say, a tribal culture somewhere in, say, Papua New Guinea or Africa somewhere, and say that the Milky Way was created as a result of some god. The Greek myth was that the Milky Way galaxy is essentially the breast milk of Hera, the Greek goddess, and so on, right? And again, so the point is not to say whether that was literally true. Okay, the metaphor is purely meant as a way of understanding. Okay, the Egyptians understood the rise and fall of the Nile, not in they obviously used some gods. God did this, God ate this, and this cat came, or whatever it is. That was not important. What was important was whether you could roughly say, on this day, the Nile is going to flood, and therefore you need to plant your crops appropriately. And that's what that mattered. Okay. And in that sense, the Ayurvedic idea of hot foods, cold foods, etc., are, if you will, ways of classifying foods based on what impact they may have had on your body and so on, at a time when genuinely we did not know what happened inside the body. Right. So it's only when we got the microscope in about the 16th century that we knew we were made of cells, and that and only the 20th century we know that the cell itself such a massively complex bundle of chemicals with so many things going on all the time, and there's RNA, DNA, and epigenetics, and a whole bunch of other insane levels of complexity, all of which if you were about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, you did not have all of that knowledge or the ability to understand that, because but you could only see what you could see. You could see people getting well, unwell. You could see some people's diets and say, fine, this seems to be working, this does not seem to be working. And you could have experiments and say, okay, I gave this person this herb and that seemed to help, so I'm going to say, fine, this herb helps with, etc., right? So that entire body of knowledge, traditional medicine systems around the world largely come by this kind of observation. Now, so therefore, I would hate to say dismiss them as saying they are unscientific or products of an unscientific mind. Absolutely not. They're actually products of scientific minds living under the constraints of the time that they lived in. That's really all there is to it, right? So in that sense, these kind of classifications, I think, made sense then. I would only say that once you understand how food works today, they may not make sense. Like, for example, obviously a whole bunch of Ayurveda in terms of which herbs cure what disease they still work because we know turmeric is good, we know ginger is good, we know garlic is good. All of that is, bulk of that knowledge has stood the test of time. Some of these kind of classifications may not have stood the test of time because now we know better, right? And in that sense, I think that's a spirit that I would really sort of take it. Like, for example, people will say, Ayurveda also say that you should not mix seafood and milk, for example. Again, yeah, I mean, within India, there are cultures that absolutely mix milk and fish and they're perfectly fine. So therefore, you should say that fine. Maybe there might have been some fish 3,000 years ago that somebody ate that badly reacted with milk. And so therefore, those people ended up saying, maybe you should not mix fish with milk. And it just ended up becoming something, but now we know better and so on. I think that's the nature of knowledge. So that's the way I would see it. So, so long story short, I'm just saying that the hot-cold distinction of Ayurveda doesn't make too much sense in today's world, although many other things in Ayurveda do. To the second point about rapid cooking, I think it's not about rapidity, it's about temperature, actually, right? High temperature is always going to destroy more than lower temperatures, period. Okay. So, which is why high temperature, shorter amount of time. So when you make something in a tandoor, you're going to cook 450 Celsius, but so you don't lose too much moisture, etc., etc. But you put in an oven at 200 Celsius and you have to cook it for 20 minutes, you're going to lose a lot more, right? And so in that sense, I think the way to see it is not as a universal rule, but try and mix it in such a way that you are eating things that have been slow cooked as well as things that have been fast cooked. Okay, because at the end of the day, certain things that are cooked at high temperatures are more delicious, and there's no point in eating food that is not delicious. So, but it's good to eat less in general, but also eat a mix of things, right? So, and another thing, some of these rules cannot be generalized at all. Carrots and tomatoes are more nutritious when cooked than when they're raw. There's more lycopene, more beta carotene available to the body when they are cooked than when you eat them raw. But this doesn't mean that you should never eat raw carrots or raw tomatoes. Raw tomatoes are fantastic in sandwiches and so on. But it's ultimately about combining and really having a more mixed, diverse diet rather than trying to make sure that, oh, I will never use hot cooking, I will never deep fry it, I will never use an air fryer. I think is a wrong approach.
I think it's fascinating, and a very important point that you've touched is the food and the taste and culture that changes between the states in India makes it most like very amazing to understand, but equally challenging to decode as well. With that, thanks a lot, Krish, Ashok. It's more of a comment by Swagatika Paul. It's an insightful talk. I'm interested to know more about the science behind the food I have had my entire life. Just placed an order for your book. And we strongly encourage, just go and grab the book by this Masala Lab. It's fantastic, and it's beyond what he has just shared in this 45 minutes presentation. It's too short to decode the entire thing. With that, I'll not keep you waiting for long, Krish, Ashok, but we greatly appreciate your time and sharing your insights on our platform. We truly enjoyed it. Wish you all the best, and we all hope to see the next edition of Masala Lab and new insights from the book. Thanks to our audience for tuning in, and hope to see you again.
Thanks for the lovely questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Goodbye. Bye.